Hello, everyone. My name is Neil. I'm a staff attorney here at the Public Health Law Center at Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law. I'll be kicking off our conversation today and introducing our main presenter, as well as facilitate the Q&A period at the end of the presentation. As Stephanie just suggested, we do have two ways that you can participate with Q&A. We have a chat option that'll be available for folks, and also for people who would like to converse in the Q&A section, we can do that at the end. So either way is fine. Just a little bit about who we are, what we do, why we care about what we do. I want to start by acknowledging that the Public Health Law Center is located at Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law in St. Paul, Minnesota. We are in the indigenous homelands of the Dakota people, also known as the Sioux Nation, and that 4 federally recognized Dakota tribal nations remain in this area. The region is also shared territory with the Anishinaabe, also known as the Ojibwe or Chippewa, and the Ho-Chunk Nation also has historic relationships to the area. We want to recognize historical wrongs and cultural resilience in spite of those wrongs, and appreciate the ongoing stewardship, spiritual connections, and lifeways that have been developed and are still practiced in these homelands upon which the law school sits. Another thing that I would like to mention is what motivates our work, like the principles underscoring why we do what we do. And those principles really evolve and revolve around equity. We want to promote equity, health equity, and other forms of equity, and the realization of the highest attainable level of health for everyone. In order to achieve that goal, we must look to not only individual health, but also the totality of circumstances which impact individual health, what the social sciences have coined the core determinants for health. Equity recognizes that each person has different circumstances, and an equitable approach is one that tailors the resources that each person needs in order for each of us to thrive in our own way. I will also take this opportunity to note that when we talk about tobacco, we're specifically referring to commercial tobacco products, Marlboro and the like. We do not include the important and traditional sacred use of tobacco as practiced by some members of our tribal communities across the nation. And lastly, just to note that how we go about enacting our principles, it's through webinars like this one, through trainings, through conversations, through materials that we help put together with our partners, with many of you. The Public Health Law Center provides information and technical assistance on issues related to tobacco and public health. The center provides educational information, model policy resources, research, and analyses. What we don't do is we don't lobby, and we don't provide legal representation or advice. We defer to local counsel, wherever you might be, for those sorts of questions. And with that, let me kick it over to my boss, who's awesome, Natalie, our senior staff attorney and the team lead for California. Natalie.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today, and I appreciate everyone coming, especially if you're able to make it to the whole series. You know that these webinars are based on a series of publications we put out this past year, talking specifically about equitable enforcement and the different model ordinances that we provide to the field. So just a quick background on tobacco retail licensing. I feel like people probably know a lot about tobacco retail licensing, or TRL as we often call it shorthand. But just to give that quick overview of that for people who might be new or don't know a lot about it, cities and counties in California have the authority to pass laws that address the sale of commercial tobacco products in their communities. And on the right there, I have a picture from a screen grab from our website where we have the Comprehensive Tobacco Retail Licensing Ordinance, a model that communities can use when they're considering passing a tobacco retail licensing ordinance or updating their ordinance. But just to give like a brief overview of what the model has, as a variety of options to address the sales of commercial tobacco products and the harms caused by commercial tobacco products. So there's often a lot of expectations of retailers, like how they can go about obtaining a license and what their expectations are as retailers. It often establishes a minimum legal sales age that's also established at state and federal law, but it's usually good to have that as well on in your ordinance in your own community. Oftentimes, communities might want to pursue something that impacts density. So looking at how close a retailer is close to something like a school, or limiting the number of retailers that can be in a community. Another policy that many jurisdictions in California have passed are restrictions on the sale of flavored tobacco products, which are especially alluring and attractive to youth. We have put out a lot of resources in the last year addressing tobacco product waste. So that's another policy that can be found in a licensing policy that addresses waste. And then there's a couple communities within California and a couple others that are pursuing it, an actual in-game policy where all sales of tobacco products would be prohibited in the community. But the main thing that we're going to talk about today is enforcement, and that's another essential part of any TRL or pretty much any ordinance that you pass, is the ability to enforce it. So when we talk about enforcement, we're talking about a balance of making sure that we're achieving the goals of enforcement and equity. And that's the main point of this publication that we put out about the enforcement guide. So what we know about enforcement is that it needs to be consistent. It needs to be severe enough that people don't want to experience whatever consequence is in the ordinance. It needs to be effective at trying to curb what you're trying to curb. And like I bolded out here, we also are focusing on it being equitable. And so I brought up, like, we're balancing this public health goals of trying to achieve a reduction in commercial tobacco harm with effectiveness and equity. And one of the questions that we don't get into much in the guide, but it's worth discussing a little bit because it's also part of equity, is thinking about actually who does the enforcement. So as we'll get into later, talking about the drawbacks of criminal penalties, especially for youth, one part of that is who does the enforcement and how they do it and the interactions between youth and those people. And so within the public health realm, it's not always possible to have an alternative than the police. That's a pretty common enforcer in many communities, but we often have this conversation with jurisdictions, and jurisdictions have this conversation internally about whether they should consider someone other than the police doing enforcement of the code. So that could look like the public health department doing it, or maybe code enforcement within the public health department. There could be some sort of other city or county agents or agency or organization that could do it. But oftentimes, police are still relied on in a lot of communities to do it. And so also making sure that the ordinance is consistent and has an equity focus can help reduce the negative impacts of using police as enforcers. And part of the reason that we're talking about this, and as Neil kind of mentioned at the beginning when he was going through the slide about how we focus our work on equity, what we're talking about for the most part is not just the direct impacts of criminal enforcement or the direct impacts of penalties that are ineffective, but also looking at how that plays into the social determinants of health. And so this is a graphic that is good to sort of discuss the social determinants of health. And it, at the very bottom, it talks about emerging public health practice, which is more focused on the upstream side of things, versus sort of historic public health practice, or maybe current public health practice, which maybe has looked more at downstream. And so we're really looking at the upstream impacts. And so when you have inequitable policies that are enforced in an equitable way, then you're really impacting someone's social environment, and you're having a lot of downstream unintended consequences from that. So the guide is meant for staff to use and for the field to use when they're having these discussions, especially internally and with city and county officials, to be able to articulate pretty easily, or have like a shorter version of like, what are we talking about exactly when we're talking about equitable enforcement. And so if you came to the last webinar, you probably already saw this, how it is structured. But for this, we have it structured that there's the most preferred, most equitable options are green, and then red is not recommended by the partnership. So I'm going to go through those various enforcement measures that we identified in the guide. So the first one that we talk about as being equitable, and really the umbrella for equity typically comes down to this idea that who is the true sort of responsible party, or who stands to make the most profit off of not complying with the ordinance. And so this consideration is not a lot, but it is different than some of the smoke-free policies, because there's not as much of a financial incentive. But for TRL policies especially, there is someone with a financial incentive, and that's the retailers. And so focusing, if nothing else you take away from this webinar or this guide, it would be that focusing the enforcement on retailers is the appropriate place to put resources. So that's kind of the overall umbrella. So the first thing that we identified as a equitable enforcement option is to use the license application renewal process to address retailers who are selling to people they shouldn't be selling to, or selling products that they shouldn't be selling. So this can incentivize retailer compliance by having the potential that they won't be able to renew their license, or if for some reason a retailer opens that, a retailer that fails a lot of inspections in one county, wants to open one in another county or another jurisdiction, it kind of puts that new jurisdiction on notice that they might have violated tobacco product sales laws in another jurisdiction. So requiring sort of that disclosure can incentivize compliance, and can also put on notice for jurisdictions that some retailers kind of have a history of non-compliance. And so then they can determine whether the fee that they're charging is adequate based on how much compliance monitoring they'll have to do, and whether whether a license could be granted or renewed based on some of that. Another option is to do compliance monitoring. And that often looks like retail inspections. And we also we separate out between compliance monitoring and youth decoy inspections. That'll be on the next slide. But just to kind of give the overview of that, the retail inspections, a lot of times they do use youth decoys, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But there's a lot of provisions in TRLs often, like I mentioned, like it's really common to have a flavor prohibition these days. And so in those circumstances, flavor prohibition might not be something that you can catch entirely with a youth retailer or a youth decoy. And so there's like some other inspection options for enforcement agencies to use to be able to ensure compliance. And we recommend in our ordinance to try to do as many per year as seems possible logistically. And we recommend maybe at least 3. And another thing about fees that I mentioned before is that the fees cover this kind of monitoring. And so that is important to look at your fees when you're using compliance monitoring to ensure that it covers the cost of doing this kind of monitoring. The next option is to use license suspensions or revocations. Those can be really strong economic incentives. Even if a retailer can't sell for a certain number of days, that can be really economically costly. And certainly if you suspend a license entirely, which means they no longer have a license, then they can't reap any benefits from the sales of commercial tobacco products. They can't sell any at all. But we also recommend, as an equitable approach, is to not to necessarily go straight to suspension or revocations, but to consider graduated penalties that have increasingly lengths of suspensions before you go necessarily to a suspension. And our model language has language for that. Another that I mentioned before, another option is to use underage decoys. So using youth that are less than 21 years old to youth or young adults to try to attempt to buy from retailers is an effective way to test whether retailers are complying with the minimum legal sales age. And it can create education opportunities for retailers that make a sales to an underage check. So that's another option for enforcement, is to require more education on the part of retailers. And we do have within the these guides sometimes cautions or notes about some of them, and what's important to note about doing compliance checks and underage sales checks. When you're using youth, they should be willing participants, they should be compensated and trained, and that will take some resources and recruitment. So it's not just entirely relying on public health staff or city staff or county staff to do the checks or the compliance monitoring. And then the last equitable enforcement option that I was going to highlight is the civil penalties against retailers. Some of the benefits of those is that you can tailor them to the circumstances, and there's an option for graduated enforcement there as well. And the caution that we have there, though, is that it does take legal resources to pursue. So you have to ensure that you're covering the cost of those types of pursuing the legal resources. So you're covering the resources with the fee as well. There are communities that also use additional penalties like nuisance or criminal penalties for against retailers, and that is part of like ongoing conversation internally about whether that is equitable and determining whether those might cause additional unintended harms. And so we do have examples of those in our model policy too, but that is worth an internal conversation or a conversation within the jurisdiction, whether to pursue those or whether they have unintended consequences that you are that you don't want to have within your community. And then for tobacco retail licenses, we have two options that we truly recommend against. The first is enforcement against retail workers. We don't have any benefits to doing that. And we caution that punishing employees is much less likely to change the overall behavior of retailers. And like I said before, employees don't have a direct financial incentive. And so it's much more equitable to attribute any actions of workers to the employer to try to ensure that the employer is providing guidance and education to their employees so that employees are not put in that position. And, employees oftentimes, if there is enforcement against retailers, it's a fine of some sort. And we all know that people who work in a lot of these, convenience stores or gas stations or something like that, that often sell commercial tobacco products are probably not making a ton of money. And so the same aspect of the sort of social determinants of health and equity and the impacts of fines on people can be really deeply felt by people who are employees in these circumstances. And the last that we do not recommend, and many jurisdictions have removed over the years, is any purchase, use, or possession penalties, or sometimes we call them PUP penalties or PUP laws. And these have historically been added to state laws and over time, especially in the 90s, from the industry lobbying themselves to try to take away limited resources of enforcement away from retailers where they're making money and onto youth and putting the onus onto youth. What we know about PUP penalties is that these aren't effective because it's not a model of how nicotine dependence or addiction works. You can't punish someone out of addiction. They are on a path of addiction at some point. And so what those people need, or those youth need, are actual interventions that help them break their addiction and not penalties. We also know that when these laws are in an ordinance and focused on youth, that criminal enforcement often disproportionately targets individuals, BIPOC individuals. And as I was saying before, this can lead to collateral consequences, or can lead to upstream consequences that or downstream consequences that are unintended. So if a youth is penalized under these sort of laws, even if it's just a fine, if they don't pay their fine, they could then be subject to additional criminal penalties, and those sorts of things can really impact someone's life. So, it can have an impact on immigration status, and probation, parole, housing, employment. And so it's inconsistent with public health goals to have these types of penalties. So those are the pretty much the overview of the different enforcement options that we identify in our model policy. And just bringing it back to this graphic that I mentioned near the beginning, is that we're really focused on trying to determine what are the unintended consequences and how we are shaping a person's environment and their social determinants so that we're improving health. And so moving away from criminal penalties, moving away from things, penalties against people who don't have financial incentive is really important to address the equity concerns in these TRLs. So with that, I think we probably have some questions. So, oh, and then Neil, I'm going to shoot it back to you.
Yeah, and I think that was a wonderful presentation, Natalie. Thank you for getting a lot of great information out to our audience. And before we kick off the Q&A, I would like to introduce another person who will be joining us for the Q&A session, Jenna Grosser. A little bit about her. She has a long history working against the tobacco industry. She's run political campaigns. She's lobbied on behalf of tobacco control organizations on Capitol Hill and for state governments, for American Heart and Lung and Cancer associations and societies, and is currently a senior program consultant with CTCP. She's teaching advocacy, coalition building, strategic planning, getting people like us and all of you working together to achieve, the common goals. And she's been leading the CTCP Endgame Social Equity Work Group for about 2 years now. So Jen, if there's anything you wanted to add about yourself before we kick off our Q&A.
That's plenty. I'm so happy to be here and answer questions from everybody. So.
Well, it's great to have you, Jenna. We only had one question so far during the talk, so I'm going to interpret that to mean Natalie did an amazing job in answering everyone's questions just as the presentation was going. But to start, Brian Davis asked, what is the typical compensation for a youth decoy? Brian, I'll start this and then I'll kick it over to Natalie and Jenna. I think it can vary a little bit, county to county, jurisdiction to jurisdiction within California. Typically, youth decoys are compensated for maybe some of the training that they receive, or if they need a driver's license, that might be paid for by the organization. They often get letters of recommendation for doing a good job, and that can go a long way. In financial terms, they might be compensated per store that they visit, something like $5 or $10 per store, with the encouragement that they try and visit as many as they want to during a particular time. So I'll then go over to Natalie to follow up on that or correct anything that I might have gotten wrong.
I honestly have never looked into what the financial compensation is. So that was really helpful, Neil. I learned something. That was a great question, Brian. I don't know, Jenna, if you have any other thoughts.
I thought Neil did a great job with that. It really depends on how much they do, how many stores. Definitely, I think compensation for training and follow-up is appropriate. But they can also, youth decoys could also be volunteers. It doesn't have to be financial necessarily. I do think one of the important things to keep in mind when you're talking about working with youth decoys is that they're not just in it for the store visit, right? So like there's the training ahead of time and there's the actual store visit, but like it's so great to capture their stories and take them to city council and take them to the next things that you're doing. You want them to be invested in the issue. So like that's a whole kit and caboodle around recruitment. And you can't necessarily pay for investment. So really be thinking about kind of a multi-faceted way to engage those youth.
I also know that like in really small communities, it's been mentioned before, like trying to be able to recruit maybe outside of the small community, because it can be, a social pressure thing or kind of hard on youth who are like trying to possibly buy from people they know. And so that's like another strategy, like within an area, whether you can share youth decoys from one community to another to try to prevent that sort of aspect of knowing the people they might be buying from, especially if your jurisdiction allows retailers to be younger and possibly in high school with them or something like that. A lot of you are people who do enforcement. So if you want to put in the chat other things that you know or tips that you have about youth decoys and recruitment and whatnot, that would be great too.
That's great. Segue, Natalie. A couple people in the chat mentioned, well, one person, Debbie Burkett, mentioned that Shasta County will use the sheriff cadets for decoys. Kristen Lambert asked a good question about could it be our youth coalition that can be the decoys? I'm seeing head nods from Natalie and Jenna. I think Kristen, yeah, absolutely, they could. Natalie just raised an excellent point, and we have a couple questions, but Brian Davis asked a really good follow-on to what Natalie was just talking about related to where are you in the great state of California? If you're in the Bay Area, if you're in LA, if you're in Sacramento, there might just be enough people there, a pool to draw upon where you're not going to necessarily have to be concerned about, oh, I've seen you before, and also you're my niece or my nephew. Like that, the situation in Chico or Shasta or some of the smaller communities might just be different in terms of where do you draw youth decoys from. And so Brian's question, what do you recommend for cities that say they don't have enough staff to manage tobacco enforcement? This isn't strictly related to decoys, but I think it's in the same spirit. So Natalie or Jenna, actually, you have it.
I'll take that one, and I want to lump it together a little bit with Cynthia, what she's talking about with compensation here. So there are a couple things in mind. Cynthia asked, like, are you talking about YATPS or TRL enforcement decoys? Both. And I think the point is really that if you have a youth decoys can be compensated if your TRL fee is adequate enough to cover compensation. And so that really gets back to the whole point. Like, do you have an adequate fee for your TRL? And if you don't, we're hitting an equity measure here. If you can't, if the TRL is enforceable, it's become a sort of a feckless law. It doesn't really matter if it can't be enforced. So ensuring that you've got an adequate fee is incredibly important. That's for the youth decoys. For YATPS, again, CTCP funds cannot be used to do enforcement. So CTCP funds cannot be used to incentivize youth to be youth decoys. For YATPS, that's different. It's evaluation for your program. It can be. I do want to draw a couple of distinctions here as well. For both YATPS and youth decoys, we're very used to saying youth. 2016 was the year that 21 and older became the age limit. That's national now, etc. But we still say youth a lot. And what we're really talking about is young adults. Sending in 15 and 16-year-olds occasionally might be all right, because if somebody's selling to somebody who looks 15 or 16 or could pass as 15 or 16, that's incredibly problematic. But we are looking at the 18, 19, 20-year-olds. What you're trying to do with the youth decoy check is make sure that IDs are being checked, and they're being checked to be valid IDs, right? So 20-year-olds are important too. So like, we are talking about college students, young people who would be doing these youth decoys. That also eliminates, in the past, we've needed those youth decoys to have sort of police with them because they were underage, right? And going back to 2016, a little history lesson. In 2016, Penal Code 308 was repealed in that it was no longer illegal for a person to possess tobacco when they were underage. So knowing that this is the case, you don't need police permission, protection, etc. to do youth decoys. Decoys can be managed by any agency who can do enforcement. Police don't need to be there. You don't need a letter from their parents if they're 18 or older, etc. So there are good points and necessary points to really trying to keep it to 18, 19, 20. And if you look at YATPS protocol, that does explain why we do it like this now.
I'm going to jump in real quick just to make note of a few things in the chat. So Penal Code 308 was not entirely repealed. What Jenna was referring to was a specific and an important provision, but there are components to 308 that are still on the books and somewhat juxtapose the Stake Act And there's an equity interest in enforcing through the Stake Act versus enforcing through 308. And that might be an invitation to have a conversation following this one. Natalie, was there anything you wanted to add to what Jenna just said?
Well, before we move on to Brian's second question about what do you do if you don't have the resources, Jenna, there's one more question about the YATPS, how you pay young adults through that. I don't know the answer to that, but I wanted to maybe get all those questions through before we move on to the other questions.
To if you want to pay for YATPS, I think all young people should be paid for employment and work, right? So, but keep in mind that that's what you can be hitting if you pay them certain ways. So incentives are where I start first. That's up to $50 per year. Again, $5-10 per store is not uncommon, plus maybe some sort of compensation for the training, which could also be a letter of recommendation or support. Maybe they're in an internship program within your program, etc. So like you've got something set up for them, and pay your interns. So like it might be part of that staff time, right? If you are looking to like pay a stipend for participation in your evaluation, or subcontract with an organization that could pay youth, just keep in mind that youth are going to have to pay taxes on whatever it is that you're giving them, and that sometimes is an extra burden because they have to pay taxes on it. It's not that you're giving them $500 stipend for like all of their participation. It's $500 minus taxes, which they have to hold on to the end of the year and then complete a complicated tax form, which they maybe don't want to spend $100 on a TurboTax or an H&R Block to have to do. So like you can complicate their lives a little bit if you aren't being really thoughtful about the way that's best to relay money to them. So just keep that in mind for young people. I would have been really annoyed having to have complicated taxes at 18.
Yes, pay your interns. But also be equitable about it, because if you're, making $300, Chris Rock has a great joke about this, but if you're making $300 and then you lose some of that to taxes, which we all support. Taxes are great. They go to the things we care about, but you're 15. We've gotten a couple questions that all relate to one another. So Natalie, if you would like to start with this, how much are typical fees for a TRL? How do you figure out how much to charge to run a TRL program? Is there a range that you can speak to?
Yeah, so and this kind of gets to Brian's other question, I suppose, as well, is that the fees are intended to cover the cost. So if there's not someone that can do it, maybe like within the police or the non-police, then you need to like assess whether the fee is enough there to find someone to make it part of their staff time to be able to do the actual compliance checks. And it could be like in a really big jurisdiction, it could be that's like all of their staff time, right, doing that, or it could be part of someone's staff time. But we have a calculator, and Stephanie's going to put it into the chat on our website that's supposed to help you figure out how much fee to charge. Recently I had a request from someone asking for sort of like an average number for their jurisdiction, or what we'd expect, because they wanted to do some calculations before they actually did it. And I found it was quite a range. So different jurisdictions, depending on probably who it is that does the enforcement, can charge really different things, and depending on how many compliance checks they plan to do, what kind of compliance checks they plan to do, all those different things go into how you calculate the fee, and plus all the other factors that are on our calculator on our website. Jenna, did you want to add anything to that?
I love that the calculator got developed, and it's really helpful. I think one of the things to be thinking about is it's long term, right? So like if you have a lot of stores that are offenders in your community and might get their licenses revoked, You know, are you going to see numbers dwindle and the fee is going to have to go higher? You want to think about a fee or a way to revisit the fee so that you're adjusting it as you go, essentially, and you don't lose money in the program. But I will go back to some of what we said last week at the last webinar, if you weren't there. Once, you know, these fees are attached, there's a lot of self-enforcement that goes into this because people don't, you know, retailers don't want to break the law. That tends to not be their jam. So, you know, when new TRLs go in place, you want the community to have the adequate enforcement fee. The city or the county usually wants the money too. And that may pay, and that pays for a lot of stuff. It pays for staff time. It could pay for the youth decoys. It could pay for consummated buys, etc. But like, you also want to make sure the program can maintain itself too in the long term. So I think that's just some things to keep in mind. And then the fee is going to vary based on how many stores you have. So a city in LA County is going to have hundreds of stores versus, you know, rural Alpine, who has exactly 2. But checking on 2 stores every now and then isn't going to cost you that much either. So maybe that leads to a little bit of a conversation about enforcement agencies and the types that you look for. But like, can you build this into people's work, existing work, like within the environmental health, or, you know, if you're what program in your community checks up on alcohol sales or checks up on, you know, does the public health department's work in terms of food and beverage and safety and whatnot. So there are always, while our communities oftentimes feel very limited to the police, and that's true in a lot of places, it's really important to investigate who could do it and then figure out from there, how much will they actually need to incorporate it into their work? Is it adding a whole brand new thing or just a little something that they're already doing?
Yeah. And I want to acknowledge too that sometimes we get the question, well, can't we just fund enforcement with fines for retailers who fail compliance checks? And we say that's probably not a great idea, because your goal is to get no one to ever have a fine. You want retailers to comply. You want retailers to want to comply with the law and not get fines. And so that's typically a really not a great idea to try to tie it to that, because it's not a sustainable source of funding, like Jenna is saying.
Yeah, you can have one good year and then no enforcement going forward, and that's just not okay.
We have a great shout out from Irene for using the fee calculator. So glad that worked out great. We have a question from Jen Swanstrom in the same ballpark. It seems figuring out what the range is the thing that people are most interested in at the moment. Can you give us a ballpark range of the low end of the scale and higher end regarding TRL fees? So we do have one example, Jen, provided by Irene in San Diego of $14.60 per year. I'll kick over to Jenna to say if that's high, low, middle, average.
I'd say that's probably the higher end of fees that I've heard. I've heard as low as, you know, 200 or 300 as well. But again, sometimes you got to step back and go, is that enough? And so that I really appreciate that San Diego used the calculator to think through the various aspects of that and what it would cost, and that's what they got to. You know, I think if the fee is too small, it becomes unmemorable as well. So like this, I mean, if you have to pay a fee, you've got to really want to be a tobacco retailer, and then you got to really want to follow the law. So there's incentive in that too. But it's going to come down to what your community's needs are. And then, you know, how much politically, you know, politics will always weigh in. So having a really good idea of what your community needs, what your enforcement agency needs, is important before going before city council or your board of supervisors. But politically, they might bulk at a really high fee. So like, you might have to negotiate and sort of find like, where's your middle ground there?
And that brings up, so the question I got recently was like, can we look at cities that are around 100,000 and figure out what the range of fees were? And I think the low end was like 150 and the high end was like 730. And I think what I noted about the 150, it was from like 2006 or something. And it was like, that also brings up our model language says something about this will be an ongoing process that we'll reassess. And like, we often recommend that jurisdictions reassess their fee, like at least, regularly, ideally like a yearly basis, so that your fee isn't from 2006 and probably isn't like accounted for if there has been an increase in retailers or just, inflation and things like that. And so giving a range is kind of tricky because there's all these like qualifiers about like, especially around the low end of fees probably being somewhat outdated, but that's another good way to address that, is to recommend that the city or county consider whether they need to change the fee based on using the calculator or whatever method they want regularly, so that it is keeping up with the current situation of enforcement.
Natalie, on that note, have you seen or heard of any mechanisms in California or that might be applicable in California where local jurisdictions can create a requirement every 3 years the fee is reassessed, or every 10 years the fee is reassessed when they initially pass a TRL?
Yeah, they could put that language into the ordinance.
So that's one possible way then that jurisdictions sort of require themselves to have to use whatever process they would like to, whether it's a committee or tie it to a CPI or consumer price index or whatever economics terminology they might want to use. But it's a way to make sure that we don't then have these zombie prices. I think someone in chat, let's see. Oh, Jenna Grosser. Jenna mentioned in chat how a lot of early TRLs were just not significant enough to really have the impact that we'd like them to when it comes to these tobacco measures.
Well, and Jen Swanstrom mentioned that there's an Oroville is only $35 a year. So yeah, that probably is not covering much. You're right about that.
And it relates to that.
Oh,
sorry, Jenna.
I was going to say, to like Jen's point, this is the case for a lot of TRLs, especially, policies always get better with time. And so a lot of TRLs that happened in the first place came with $0 fees. The city council was like, this will just make you feel better and maybe get the tobacco people off our backs, right? But like the $35 fees, the not even close to covering thing fees, there's nothing stopping you from going back and wanting to update it, make your ordinance more comprehensive, and get that fee reassessed.
Sorry.
I was just gonna say, just keep that in mind that you can do that too. Just because it exists doesn't mean you can't make it better. And
that's where our model language doesn't actually have putting the actual fee in the ordinance. It says something about they're going to reassess it, and they usually do it. I think our model language talks about doing it through the resolution process, but it's like, an evaluation that happens regularly, and then it's established somewhere else and is not just like codified in the ordinance, so that doesn't become like a barrier to updating it.
That's really, really important. The other thing I would recommend everybody do in your research, just as you're getting to know your community, you're doing your policy record review, is to research what other licenses and fees exist and how those get updated. Because you can easily work with Public Health Law Center to say this is how alcohol licensing or how other licensing is done in the community. Let's follow that. We could follow that procedure, and then just kind of it folds in, right?
So continuing on, Lauren Kemeter asked, I hope I pronounced that right, Lauren. Sorry for anyone's name who I butcher. Lauren asks a great question about the state tobacco license, how much it is, what is done with that. Lauren, I can tell you that it's about $265 a year, unless that's changed since Googling it 30 seconds ago, and what is done with it. So Jenna, you'd be a great person who can answer that. What does the state of California do with that money?
This webinar is being recorded, correct?
It is. Yes.
Okay.
Gavin Newsom is my homeboy, so.
Yeah, the politically correct answer is that CDTFA, that is the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration, administers that license and takes the fee, and that manages their fee and licensing program. What doesn't happen with the state license is a lot of local enforcement. So local enforcement, having local TRLs is incredibly important because local enforcement can happen in your communities. There is a process to report stores that are selling, but it takes more than one report. You have to be consistent with it. And then the state goes through a whole process. And it's just not, it's not nearly as effective as what can be done at the local level with a regular TRL and a regular program in place. And quite frankly, all of you watching over it and just like being on top of what's going on in your community and knowing that certain stores may still be selling. This is going to be incredibly important to remember if SB 793 should be upheld after the election, that we still need TRLs in place locally to enforce flavored laws, couponing laws, price, minimum price and pack size laws, everything, all the goodies that are contained within a comprehensive TRL. We still need the TRLs to do it. So like, keep up the good local TRL work. Say to that fee.
Thank you, Jenna. I wanted to circle back for just a second. And since we're getting so many questions about the fees and the calculator, I thought, and Stephanie looked for it for me real quick and she's going to put it in the chat. We did do a webinar about the fee calculator that's recorded that you can check out on our website too. And you can always email us any specific questions, but I was thinking that there was some sort of webinar. So if you want to rewatch that, that might answer questions about fees and the calculator as well. But thank you, Jenna, for that question, or for answering that question.
And Natalie just said something that we want to reiterate to everyone on the call, that the Public Health Law Center is here to help with these questions. So by all means, you can email Natalie, myself, anyone else directly, and we can work with you on a one-on-one basis to answer whatever questions that we don't get to today or that might come up later or what have you. Another question from Brian. Brian asking a lot of the great questions. If you are suggesting a mix of the tobacco license fee and DOJ or stake funds to cover enforcement costs, what are the things that should definitely be covered by the TRL fee versus the DOJ stake grant? Jenna.
I am not suggesting that a mix of the fees is possible. Again, CDTFA is its own agency. CTCP doesn't get to oversee what it does with the fee. So I do think local independence is important in this case. But your local fee should be able to cover the maintenance, the processing, the repeal of a license if it's necessary. The fine schedule, staying on top of a store and making sure that they're doing what's right by the community. I think that's the easiest answer to this. All you can control is what you can do. All you have influence over, because you don't control it, is what you can do locally.
Well, and it's recently come up too, in addition to that, Jenna, is whatever due process that you have as well. So like if you allow the retailers to appeal and there's some sort of like hearing or something, like that whole thing is part of what the fee can cover too, to ensure that you're like full circle enforcing the ordinance and full circle of that whole enforcement process.
And Cynthia just put in the chat exactly what I was thinking next is about the communication, is if your local entity has revoked a TRL, that should be something that the state is aware of too, so that they're not getting a TRL from the state after you've been repealed. It's something you need to report. They're two different processes. I don't make how California government works, so like it's not an instantaneous thing, but it is worth sharing. And there is a mechanism to do that with CDTFA, which we do not have time, nor do I want to cover today. But I would encourage you to visit CDTFA's website to learn more.
Someone did ask you that, so
Oh, yeah, that was one of the
HB.
questions.
Did they?
visit the website of CDTFA. If you need more help, let us know. And Karen, I see what you're saying. So I think this is true. So you would need a state license and you would need a TRL, and you would be paying both those fees if you're a retailer, but they're not going the same place or doing the same thing at all.
That is correct. Consider them separate.
So I'll make note then that Deborah Kelly also just made mention of how the County of San Diego is having a meeting with the CDTFA field supervisor to facilitate this communication. That's something that all jurisdictions absolutely could and should consider doing, just to create or to make it easier to have then that mechanism of ensuring that there's nothing lost when a license is revoked by a community, and then that retailer just tries to get a state license and leave it at that.
Well, and Deborah, that might be like a good update to give on a ledger call at some point too, how that went and what you found out about it, because it seems like everyone is interested in how that works, that interaction.
I'm certainly eager to hear more.
I think we're
coming up on time. Yeah. Are there any last minute questions that we can throw at Natalie and Jenna before the end of this webinar?
I have a couple of quick thoughts.
Sure.
That we haven't really touched on, but on the equity point, one of the things, I'm going to talk about your policy record review again, but one of the things I really want to encourage everybody to be doing is looking for those PUP laws in your existing city and county codes. PUP laws have been around for a long time, despite 308B. There's more than once we've come across PUP laws that people did not know existed. Maybe they're not attached to tobacco laws exactly, but like there's criminal enforcement for possession of things in another part of code. So there, you can use some different keywords around looking for it, but I really want to encourage you guys to be doing that work. And if you find PUP laws, let's work to get them repealed. Not only do we want to prevent them from coming up, but we don't want them to continue to exist. So really be thinking about that as part of this bigger picture of a comprehensive TRL. Sometimes we got to get rid of the bad stuff too.
And that's something you can ask us to help you with too. If you find something or you're not sure or you need help trying to figure out if you have them, you can send us an email as well and we can help you as your legal technical assistance provider.
My final thought is that comprehensive is best, y'all. So as often as you can use your model ordinance and be striving to get everything, the whole kit and caboodle in. If your community is not ready to just get rid of tobacco altogether and let's get them ready. But in the meantime, a comprehensive TRL is the best, most protective thing we can do especially for our young people. So just really focus on making sure the whole kit and caboodle, as much of it as you can get, is a part of your work.
I'm gonna have Stephanie put in the yep, she just did put in the chat one more time our community needs assessment. So we're only a few short on how many people we need to complete it. So if you haven't completed it yet and you can, we'd really appreciate it.
Thank you all on behalf of Jenna, Natalie, myself, the Public Health Law Center for being a part of this webinar. We were glad to have your questions. And if you do have any further questions, if anything comes up now or later or unrelated to this at all, but you just want to talk to somebody, you can reach us at any time. We might not respond at any time, but we will respond as promptly as we can. And with that, I will thank you all and wish you all a wonderful day.